wanted to talk about is begin a series of messages on the progression from lust to sin, and it describes our thought process between having the idea first pop in our head all the way to potentially carrying it out as an act of sin. And we see a lot of this process described in James chapter 1. We're going to go over the progression from lust to sin, and a lot of this is described. We see this described in James chapter 1, and we're going to start with this passage. We're going to key off of it, and today we're going to focus on lust, the word translated lust in this passage, and that's going to be our focus. But I want to establish this passage from the beginning. So let's go to James 1, and we'll start in verse 12. It says, "Blessed is the man who endures temptation, for when he is tried, he will receive the crown of life, which the Lord has promised to those who love him. Let no man say when he is tempted, I am tempted of God. For God cannot be tempted with evil, neither tempts he any man. But every man is tempted when he is drawn away of his own lust and enticed. Then when lust has conceived, it brings forth sin, and sin, when it is finished, brings forth death." So we can see there's a progression towards sin that's being described here. And I'm just going to go over this passage a couple times. We see that there's three different things named here in this passage. We have temptation first mentioned in verses 12 and 13 and 14. It also says in verse 14 that everyone is tempted when he's drawn away by his own lust and enticed. And so we have lust coming first, and then when he's drawn away by it, that man is tempted. And then in verse 15, when lust has conceived, it gives birth to sin. And so we see this progression from lust to temptation to sin. And this is described here in James 1, and it's important because it helps us understand what is the thought process that goes into that can lead to us sinning. Helps us understand a little better where our defense against our enemies comes in. It also helps us understand what sin actually is, which is important. Understanding what all these other mental processes are that come before sin, that are not sin but can lead to sin, helps us understand sin is an action. And when we go over sin specifically, we will look more closely at that. But today I'm going to look at lust specifically, what's translated lust, which is the word epithumia. And what I'm going to want to emphasize today is what that word means. What's the best way to translate or think of that word? And so we're going to focus on that today. But I just want to run through and summarize this progression. So even though we haven't gone over these words and we'll go over them in more detail, I just want to summarize what this progression is. You're starting with lust, which is a desire of some kind. You could then proceed to temptation, which is what happens when uh, you make that desire your own. You're being tempted or tested by it. Um, and there's a difference between the desire and being tempted by the desire. And we'll go over that in a couple weeks when we look at temptation specifically. You also have a fourth word that's not mentioned here in James 1. Um, let's just go over to um, Ephesians 2 real fast. And I just want to point out that this exists, even though it's not here in the passage, and it's important enough so that we will also spend a message going over this word. Um, Ephesians 2:1. Ephesians 2:1 says, "And you has he quickened or made alive, who were dead in trespasses and sins." And so we have a word here, trespass. We can see it's not the same as sin, obviously, because it's used alongside sin. Um, Over in Galatians 6, we just turn to the left a little bit. Galatians 6:1, we'll see this word again. It says, "Brethren, if a man be overtaken in a fault," and it's translated fault here in the King James, but it's the same word that we just saw in Ephesians. It's trespass, uh, parapatoma. If brethren, if a man is overtaken in a trespass, you who are spiritual, restore such a one in the spirit of meekness, considering yourself, lest you also be tempted. And so in this verse, we see it used in the same context with temptation. So here we have trespass and temptation. In Ephesians, we had sin and trespass. And so we see it's something distinct from those two things. And uh, we're going to go over this in a future message in this series, but trespass is essentially referring to a decision uh, to sin. And that's why it's different from sin, because it's not the act of sin, it's the decision to. And it's different from temptation because it takes that a step further and makes a decision. And we'll see that in the future. And so we have a desire, a temptation, trespass, which is a decision. And then finally, we have sin, which is the act itself. And that kind of spoils the future messages, I guess, but uh, that's the meaning uh, of those words, just to give an overview of how this progression works. What we're going to focus on today is the very beginning of that progression, which is what's translated lust in James 1. And uh, this is a basic word for desire. Um, the Greek New Testament uses this as the general word for desire, both good and bad. And it's important to uh, establish that this can be used for good or bad, and then also establish, what are we looking for uh, if we're trying to avoid sinning, then what are we looking for in a desire? What are we looking out for? So let's look at some passages that describe some good desires. This word is used to describe some good desires. Let's go over to Matthew chapter 13. And we're going to look at some passages that deal with this um, as a good desire, and we'll look at several of these. Matthew, let's start in verse 13 of chapter 13. Jesus says, "Therefore I speak to them in parables, because seeing they see not, and hearing they hear not, neither do they understand. And in them is fulfilled the prophecy of Isaiah, who says, by hearing you will hear and will not understand, and seeing you will see and will not perceive. For this people's heart is waxed gross, and their ears are dull of hearing, and their eyes they have closed, lest at any time they should see with their eyes, and hear with their ears, and should understand with their heart, and should be converted, and I should heal them." Now, this is bad. This is not good. But in contrast, we're going to see in verse 16, "But blessed are your eyes, for they see, and your ears, for they hear. For truly I say to you that many prophets and righteous men have desired to see those things which you see, and have not seen them, and to hear those things which you hear, and have not heard them." And what's translated desired in the King James is uh, our word epithumia, or the verb epithumeo. Uh, this is what's translated lust a lot of the time, but here it's translated desire, and this is the word for desire, and we can see this is describing a good desire. Um, we can see there's times it's used as the desire for food because you're hungry. So over in Luke 15, um, we're dealing with the prodigal son who's left his father and wandered off on his own. Picking up in verse 13 of chapter 15, and it says, "And not many days after, the younger son gathered all together and took his journey into a far country, and there wasted his substance with riotous living. And when he had spent all, there arose a mighty famine in that land, and he began to be in want. And he went and joined himself to a citizen of that country, and he sent him into his fields to feed swine. And he would have filled his belly with the husks that the swine ate, and no man gave to him." And so he desired, this is our word used again, he desired to fill his stomach with what he was feeding the pigs because he was starving. Um, and so it's used of hunger. We can see, let's go over to Luke chapter 22. Jesus actually describes himself desiring. Luke 22, 14 says, "And when the hour was come, he sat down, and the 12 apostles with him. And he said to them, With desire I have desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. For I say to you, I will not eat any more thereof until it be fulfilled in the kingdom of God." And so, he says, with desire I have desired, and so really is with epithumia I have epithumeod. Uh, and so it's both the noun and the verb here. And so Jesus is using this of himself. And so obviously, this is not a sinful desire. This is not a desire that could lead to sin. Um, it's referring to him wanting to eat the Passover. And you'll notice I've kind of just slipped into calling it desire instead of lust. Um, I'm not sure how comfortable I would be saying that Jesus is lusting. Uh, Desire is a word in English that can be good or bad, and at this point, lust is a word in English that's has a bad connotation. And so desire just kind of emphasizes the fact that this word is being used for both good and bad desires. We can see Paul use this a couple times. We can look over at Philippians chapter 1. Um, Another clear example of a good desire. Verse 21 of Philippians 1 says, "For me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain. But if I live in the flesh, this is the fruit of my labor. Yet what I will choose, I don't know. For I am in a strait betwixt two, having a desire to depart and be with Christ, which is far better. Nevertheless, to abide in the flesh is more needful for you." And so uh, Paul has a desire to depart. Once again, that's our word, epithumia. He has a desire to be with Christ. And obviously, again, that's a good desire. Um, Over in 1 Timothy 3, we'll look at one more of these. This is used of uh, the office of a bishop or pastor. 1 Timothy 3:1 says, "This is a true saying. If a man desires the office of a bishop, he desires a good work." Um, and so, again, this is, and here it just clearly says he desires a good work. Um, and so there's more as well, but just looking at some passages, it makes it clear this is a word that can be used of good desires, but as we know, it can also be used of bad desires. Um, and that's also clearly stated. So let's look at some examples of bad desires, just to establish this word. 1 Corinthians chapter 10. Uh, and this is in a larger context, looking at the Israelites, um, and in picking up in verse 5, it says, "But with many of them God was not well pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness. Now these things were our examples to the intent that we should not lust after evil things, as they also lusted." Um, and here the King James translates it lust both times. We should not desire after evil things as they also desired. And so here we have an example of uh, bad desire, desiring after evil things. Um, Literally, really, it says we should not be lusters uh, uh, of evil. Um, we see in Ephesians 4 um, another bad adjective attached to desire. Ephesians 4, um, 22 says that you put off concerning the former conversation or conduct, manner of life, the old man, which is corrupt according to the deceitful lusts. And so here we have deceitful desires, obviously, another example of bad desires. And we have other examples of a negative adjective being attached to the word. Uh, let's just look at Colossians 3. Colossians 3:5. It says, "Put to death, therefore, your members which are upon the earth, fornication, uncleanness, inordinate affection, which is passions, evil concupiscence," which is how the King James translates evil desires, um, and covetousness, which is idolatry. Um, seems like Paul was just trying to cover his bases with bad desires in this list. But again, this is an example of you have the word desire, but then you also have kakos or evil, bad attached to it, which kind of indicates that that's not, wouldn't be indicated by the word desire on its own. And we've seen that. We've seen it used of good desires, and now we're seeing it used of bad desires. Um, 1 Timothy chapter 6, picking up in verse 6, it says, "But godliness with contentment is great gain. For we brought nothing into this world, and it is certain we can carry nothing out. And having food and clothes, let us therewith be content. But they that will be rich are the ones that decide to be rich, determined to be rich, fall into temptation and a snare, and into many foolish and hurtful lusts, which drown men in destruction and perdition." And so here's another example of a lust clearly being described as bad. Let's look at one more in this group. Let's look at Jude. Um, just like with the good desires, there's more examples we could look at, but um, I don't need to spend the whole message just looking at examples of good and bad desires. Um, we'll look at this one in Jude. Um, we'll pick up in verse 16. It says, "These are murmurers, complainers, walking after their own lusts, their own desires, and their mouth speaking great swelling words, having men's persons in admiration because of uh, advantage. But beloved, remember the words which are spoken before by the apostles of our Lord Jesus Christ, how that they told you there would be mockers in the last time, who should walk after their own ungodly lusts." And so we see several examples of good desires. We see several examples of bad desires. And so it's important because we understand not every desire is bad. Not every desire is one that can lead to sin. And so we need to understand from the beginning what desires are there that can be a problem. And I'm not going to go over all the different possible works of the flesh and ways that Satan could attack us and so forth, but at least not today. But I do want to go over the fact that we can be attacked with a desire from each of our enemies. And so I want to look at some passages that mention our enemies. And so the Christian has three enemies. We have sin nature, uh, can also be referred to as the flesh. We have Satan and his demons also that can attack us. And we also have the world system. And there are some passages that mention our enemies connected with desire. So let's go over to Romans 13, and we'll start by um, looking at some examples of uh, the fact that the sin nature um, has desires or lusts uh, that we need to be careful of. And so in Romans chapter 13, we'll pick up in verse 13. And it says, "Let us walk honestly as in the day, not in rioting and drunkenness, um, not in chambering or literally beds and wantonness, not in strife and envying, but put on the Lord Jesus Christ and make not provision, stop making provision for the flesh to fulfill the lusts thereof." And so here Paul instructs them, stop doing this. Don't make provision to fulfill the lusts of the flesh. And so we see that the flesh, it has desires, and it's possible that we could wind up fulfilling them. Um, as we know, there's a defense against this. Um, we can look over in Galatians 5, and we see this word for desire mentioned again with the flesh. Galatians 5:16, here talking about um, the flesh, and this passage lists works of the flesh below, but we'll look at verse 16, which says, "This I say then, walk in the Spirit, and you will not fulfill the lust of the flesh." And again, this is pretty emphatic. You will never, ever fulfill the lust from the flesh if you're walking by the Spirit. And so we see that there is such a thing as a desire from the flesh. It goes on in verse 17, and it says, "For the flesh lusts against the Spirit, and the Spirit against the flesh. And these are contrary one to the other, so that you cannot do the things uh, that you would. But if you were led of the Spirit, you were not under law." So this is interesting because it also describes the Spirit lusting against the flesh, as well as the flesh against the Spirit. And these are contrary one to the other, so you cannot do the things that you want. And so uh, we can look at First Peter 2, and it's kind of similar to that, where it uh, talks about the fact that the lusts of the flesh are at war, but instead of uh, lusting against the Spirit in this passage, we see our soul mentioned in First Peter 2, in verse 11. It says, "Dearly beloved, I beseech you, as strangers and pilgrims, abstain from fleshly lusts which war against the soul." Now, they campaign against the soul. And so, we see our soul can be affected. It's the desires from the flesh. They're contrary to the Holy Spirit. They campaign against our soul. And so our sin nature, as we know, is uh, a dangerous enemy. And we can see that this word for desire, for lust is attached to it. Um, we look over at Ephesians chapter 2. Um, let's see another example of this um, in Ephesians 2:3. It says, among whom also we all had our conversation, or we conducted ourselves in times past in the lusts of our flesh, fulfilling the desires of the flesh and of the mind, and were by nature the children of wrath, even as others. Um, Here in this verse, you see first it describes the desires of the flesh, and then it goes on to say fulfilling the desirous will of the flesh, the thelema. And so this is a word that's attached to our sin nature, and it is used in the same context with our flesh or sin nature several times. We can also see it with the other two enemies as well. In John 8, we have an example with Satan. John chapter 8. Um, Jesus is speaking to the Jewish leaders who were arguing with him. Um, and in verse 41, he says, you do the deeds of your father. And they said to him, Jesus, we are not born of fornication. We have one Father, even God. And Jesus said to them, if God were your Father, you would love me, for I proceeded forth and came from God. Neither came I of myself, but he sent me. Why do you not understand my speech? Even because you cannot hear my word. You are of your father, the devil, and the lusts of your father you will do. Um, he was a murderer from the beginning and abode not in the truth, because there is no truth in him. When he speaks a lie, he speaks of his own, for he is a liar and the father of it. And because I tell you the truth, you believe me not. And so Jesus says there of their father, the devil, he says Satan is their father, and that the lusts of their father Satan they will do, or they desire to do, they desirously will to do. Um, and so the desires and lusts from Satan. And we know Satan attacks us as well as the sin nature and the world system. Um, but we see that those come in the form of desires. We also have desires from the world system. Um, let's look at Titus chapter 2. Let's just read verse 12, which says, teaching us that denying ungodliness and worldly lusts, we should live soberly, righteously, and godly in this present age. So we see worldly lusts named here in Titus. Um, if we go over to 2 Peter, we'll pick up a couple more examples. 2 Peter chapter 1. Verse 4 says, whereby are given to us exceeding great and precious promises, that by these you might be partakers of the divine nature, having escaped the corruption that is in the world through lust, or in lust, by lust. Um, and so we see lust is a problem here, and we'll also look at First John chapter 2. And we'll look at verses 16 and 17. We have the flesh mentioned here again, but we also have the world mentioned. 1 John 2. We'll start in verse 15, which says, love not the world, neither the things that are in the world. If any man loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, and the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, is not of the Father, but is of the world. It's out from the world. And the world passes away, or is passing away, and the lusts of it. But he that does the will of God abides forever, or into the age. And so we see lust from the flesh mentioned in verse 16. We saw several of those. We also see the world's lusts mentioned as passing away in verse 17. And so all three enemies wind up getting linked to this word for desire. Um, and when we're talking about a progression from desire to sin, it's going to start with one of our enemies. It's important to remember that not all desire that we ever feel is something that's going to lead to sin or something that's bad. Um, but we also understand that there are desires that we can be attacked by our three enemies, and that can lead to sin. Um, and so uh, we're going to look at that progression in this series. We're going to look at a couple weeks from now. We're going to look at temptation, which is the next step to sinning, and this is going to look at what needs to happen for a desire to start being a problem. It's possible for us to uh, deal with a desire appropriately and for us not to be tempted by it. But it's also possible that we can become tempted by it. And so we'll look at that transition and we'll look at temptation